The night was filled with laughter, music, and the sound of clinking glasses. The mansion stood like a glowing palace on the hill, every corner lit with gold and silver lights. Inside, people dressed in their finest clothes gathered around the long marble tables, talking and laughing as servants moved quietly, making sure every glass was full and every plate was perfect. The man who owned the mansion was a millionaire, proud and loud, always wanting to be the center of attention. He loved when people admired him, and tonight he was in a very good mood. Among the guests and the shining chandeliers, a quiet man worked in the background. He wore a simple uniform, his hands slightly rough from years of cleaning and fixing things around the house. He moved softly, trying not to be noticed. He was the caretaker, a man who had been working in the mansion for months, cleaning floors, fixing lights, and keeping the place spotless. Most people barely noticed him. To them, he was invisible, just part of the staff who made everything run smoothly. As he passed by the grand piano in the center of the hall, he paused for a moment. The piano was beautiful, shining under the lights, untouched for most of the evening. A small smile appeared on his face, but he quickly looked away and continued his work. No one noticed that moment except the millionaire. The millionaire saw him looking at the piano and smirked. He nudged one of his friends and whispered something, then raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Hey, caretaker," he said loudly, a mocking tone in his voice. The music in the room stopped and people turned to look. The caretaker froze, unsure if he had done something wrong. "Tell me," the millionaire said with a grin, "do you know how to play this piano?" The caretaker hesitated, not sure what to say. He simply nodded a little and looked down. The millionaire laughed. "Oh, really? Well then, play something for us. Let's see what kind of music you can make." The guests began to chuckle, waiting to see what would happen. The caretaker looked at the piano again. His hands trembled slightly. He hadn't touched one in years. Music had once been his life, but now it was only a memory he carried deep inside. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say a word, the millionaire interrupted again, louder this time. "If you can play that piano, I'll marry you myself." The room erupted in laughter. People clapped and cheered, finding the idea ridiculous. The caretaker stood there quietly, the laughter echoing in his ears. He gave a small, tired smile, not out of amusement but out of politeness, then softly said, "No, sir, I'm just here to work," and walked away. The laughter followed him as he disappeared into the kitchen. To the guests, it was just a funny moment. To him, it was another reminder of how cruel the world could be. When the party ended and the guests left one by one, the mansion grew quiet. The lights dimmed and only a few candles flickered near the piano. The caretaker returned to the hall to clean up. Empty glasses, half-eaten desserts, and napkins were scattered everywhere. He worked silently, collecting them one by one, his mind far away. Every now and then his eyes would drift back to the piano. He stood beside it, his reflection faintly visible on its polished surface. He reached out, hesitated, then gently touched one of the keys. A soft note filled the air, pure and trembling. He pressed another, then another, and soon a small melody began to flow. His fingers were rusty, but the feeling came back slowly, like an old friend returning after years apart. The music was soft at first, but it grew deeper, warmer. The notes told a story of pain and hope, of dreams lost and memories that refused to fade. The caretaker closed his eyes and played as if the world around him didn't exist. For the first time in years, he felt alive again. He didn't know that someone had come back to the hall. One of the guests had forgotten her purse and returned quietly to get it. She stood near the doorway, frozen in place, listening. The melody filled the air with something raw and beautiful. It wasn't just music. It was emotion, honesty, something no fancy performance could ever replace. When the caretaker finally stopped, she remained silent for a long moment, her heart still beating fast. Then she quietly left, making sure not to disturb him. The caretaker looked around, realizing how late it had become. The clock struck midnight. He smiled faintly, closed the piano lid, and whispered to himself, "Maybe once more someday." Then he turned off the lights and walked away. The next morning, sunlight filled the mansion. The millionaire bragged to his friends about how successful his party had been. He didn't think twice about the man he had mocked the night before. To him, it was just another evening of fun. But for the caretaker, something had changed inside. That brief moment with the piano had stirred something he thought was gone forever. He went about his work as usual, sweeping the marble floors, polishing the silver trays, and watering the plants. But his mind kept drifting back to that melody. Every time he passed by the piano, he slowed down just a little, his fingers twitching with the urge to play again. The mansion staff noticed the small smile that appeared on his face now and then, though no one knew the reason why. Later that afternoon, as he was cleaning the front hall, the same woman who had overheard him came back to the mansion. She was a well-known pianist, though few knew it that night. She had been thinking about the caretaker's playing ever since she heard it. She asked the staff if she could speak with him. When he came forward, wiping his hands nervously, she looked at him and said softly, "That was you last night, wasn't it?" "You were the one playing the piano." The caretaker froze. He didn't know how to answer. For a long time, he just looked at the floor and said, "I'm sorry if I disturbed anyone, ma'am. I didn't mean to." She smiled and shook her head. "Disturb? You moved everyone who heard you, even if they didn't know it yet. You play with your heart, not just your hands. You have a gift." He was silent. Compliments were rare in his life, and he didn't know what to say. She asked him how long it had been since he played. He sighed and said quietly, "Many years. Life got in the way. I had to stop." She nodded slowly, understanding without asking too much. She handed him a small card and said, "If you ever want to play again, come here. I teach at a small music school nearby. I would love for you to visit." Then she smiled one last time and left. The caretaker stood there holding the card, unsure if it was real or a dream. He looked at the words written on it and whispered, "A music school." For the rest of the day, he kept the card in his pocket, touching it now and then, as if afraid it might disappear. That night, when everyone had gone to bed, he walked to the piano once more. He sat down, took a deep breath, and began to play again, quietly, gently, letting the music fill the empty hall. Each note felt like a heartbeat, each melody like a step toward something new. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a caretaker. He felt like himself again. The next few days passed slowly. The millionaire didn't mention the joke again, though every now and then he caught the caretaker glancing at the piano and rolled his eyes. The guests had already forgotten the moment, but destiny had not. Something had started that night, a spark that would soon grow into something no one expected. In the evenings, when the house grew quiet, the caretaker would sit near the piano and play softly to himself. He never knew if anyone could hear, but it didn't matter. The music belonged to him again. It reminded him of his mother, of the little music competitions he had entered as a boy, of the joy he once felt performing on stage. Life had changed, but the music inside him had never truly died. It had just been waiting for a reason to come back. One evening, as he finished cleaning the last room, he walked by the grand hall again and saw the millionaire standing near the piano, holding a glass of wine. The man looked at him with a strange expression and said half-jokingly, "So, caretaker, you still thinking about that little challenge? Maybe you'll surprise us one day." The caretaker smiled politely and said, "Maybe, sir. Maybe one day." Then he quietly walked away, but this time his heart was lighter. Deep down, he knew that day would come, the day when his music would speak louder than any laughter. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and the mansion lights flickered softly. The caretaker looked up at the night sky, his hands still tingling from the memory of the keys. He whispered to himself, "They laughed today, but someday, they will listen." Then he smiled and walked back inside, ready for whatever life would bring next. The days passed quietly after the night of the party, but something inside the caretaker had changed. He still cleaned the same rooms, polished the same floors, and followed the same routine. But now there was a small light in his eyes. Every time he walked by the piano, he slowed down. Sometimes he would stop and gently brush the dust off the surface, pretending he was just doing his job. But deep down, his heart wanted to touch those keys again. The sound of that music still echoed in his mind like a whisper that refused to fade. He hadn't played in years, not since his life had fallen apart. Long before he worked in this mansion, he had been someone else. He once lived in a small apartment filled with old sheet music and a second-hand piano that barely stayed in tune. Back then, he taught children how to play and performed in small cafes. He wasn't famous, but he was happy. Music was his purpose. But when tragedy struck and bills piled up, He had to sell his piano just to survive. Slowly, the music left his life, replaced by silence and the sound of hard work. Now every time he touched the piano in the mansion, those old feelings came back, warm and painful at the same time. He would tell himself, it's just a memory, but it didn't feel like one. It felt alive. One afternoon, while he was sweeping the main hall, he heard footsteps behind him. When he turned, it was the same woman from the night of the party, the one who had heard him play. She smiled kindly and said, "I see you're still taking care of this piano." He nodded nervously, unsure what to say. She placed her purse on a chair and said softly, "Do you remember what I told you that night? That you have a gift?" He looked down, embarrassed, and replied, "I'm just a worker, ma'am. Those days are gone." She shook her head and said, "No, they're not. You only stop being what you love when you give up completely." He didn't know how to respond. No one had spoken to him like that in a long time. She took a small music notebook from her purse and placed it on the piano. "This is for you," she said. "It's an old piece I wrote years ago. If you ever want to play again, start with this." Then she smiled and left before he could thank her. That evening, after everyone had gone to sleep, he returned to the hall. The lights were dim and the room was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock. He sat on the piano bench and opened the notebook. The notes on the page looked familiar, but his fingers trembled as he tried to remember how to read them. Slowly, he placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The melody was gentle, almost like a conversation between two hearts. Each note seemed to carry a memory from his past, the laughter of his students, his mother humming in the kitchen, the applause from his last performance years ago. It was all there, hidden in the music. He played for hours that night, lost in the sound. The piano seemed to come alive under his touch. For a moment he forgot who he was. He wasn't a caretaker anymore. He was a musician again. But when morning came, he knew things couldn't stay this way forever. He still needed his job. The millionaire wasn't a kind man, and if he found out his caretaker was using the piano, he might fire him. So the caretaker decided to keep it a secret. Each night, when the mansion was empty, he would sneak into the hall and play for an hour. It became his quiet escape, his hidden world. What he didn't know was that someone else had begun to notice. The millionaire's assistant, a sharp young man who managed the staff, had seen the caretaker leaving the hall late at night several times. At first, he thought nothing of it, but curiosity got the better of him. One night, he stayed behind and followed him quietly. When he peeked through the doorway, he froze. The caretaker was playing the piano with such emotion that it felt almost unreal. The assistant had never seen anything like it. The man who spent his days cleaning floors now looked like a completely different person. He decided not to interrupt and quietly left. The next morning, the assistant told the millionaire what he had seen. The millionaire laughed. "The caretaker? Playing the piano? You must be joking." The assistant insisted it was true, but the millionaire waved his hand. "Maybe I should let him play at the next party. It will be good entertainment," he said mockingly. The assistant hesitated, knowing the caretaker would be embarrassed, but he didn't argue. A week later, the millionaire announced he would host another gathering, this time with live performances. He told the staff to prepare the house and mentioned casually, "Our caretaker will be performing something special this time." When the caretaker heard that, he froze. "Sir, I don't think I can—" But the millionaire cut him off with a laugh. "Relax, you said you could play, right? Show us what you got." The caretaker felt a mix of fear and disbelief. He had never agreed to perform, especially not in front of people who had laughed at him before. But the millionaire insisted, and refusing wasn't an option. That night he sat alone in his small room, staring at the piano notebook the woman had given him. His hands shook as he whispered, "I can't do this. Not again." But deep inside, another voice whispered back, "You have to." The next few nights he practiced secretly, hoping to find the courage. He played until his fingers hurt, until his back ached, until he could close his eyes and still see the keys in front of him. Every mistake made him nervous, every memory made him emotional. He wasn't playing to impress anyone. He was playing to prove to himself that the music hadn't left him. The night before the party, the woman returned. She had heard about the event through a friend and came to see him. When she found him sitting quietly in the corner of the hall, she smiled and said, "You look worried." He nodded. "They're all expecting me to fail," he said softly. She shook her head and replied, Then surprise them. You don't have to play for them. Play for yourself. Her words stayed with him. That night he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the laughter from the last party, the humiliation he felt, and the music that had kept him alive since then. He realized this performance wasn't about the millionaire or the guests. It was about reclaiming his dignity. When morning came, the mansion buzzed with activity. Decorations were hung, tables were set, and a new grand piano was polished until it shone like glass. Guests began to arrive in their glittering clothes, laughing and greeting each other. The millionaire was in high spirits, telling everyone about the special surprise of the evening. The caretaker dressed neatly, his uniform freshly ironed, but his heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to disappear, but there was no escape. When the time came, the millionaire stood up and said loudly, "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight you will witness something unique. Our very own caretaker will entertain us on the piano." The room erupted in laughter and applause. Some clapped out of curiosity, others out of mockery. The caretaker walked slowly toward the piano. His legs felt heavy and his throat was dry. He sat down, hands trembling above the keys. The room grew quiet, waiting to see him fail. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and remembered the woman's words. "Play for yourself." His fingers began to move. At first the sound was soft, uncertain, but then the melody grew stronger, smoother, fuller. The room went silent. The notes rose and fell like waves, each one filled with emotion that words could never express. The caretaker wasn't performing anymore. He was telling his story through the music, a story of loss, struggle, and hope. The millionaire's smile faded. The laughter stopped. People leaned forward, unable to look away. The final note hung in the air like a whisper. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then slowly the guests began to clap. The applause grew louder and louder until the hall was filled with the sound. Some even stood up, tears in their eyes. The caretaker bowed his head, overwhelmed. For the first time in years, he felt seen. The millionaire, embarrassed but trying to hide it, stood and clapped as well. He forced a smile and said, "Well, I suppose talent can come from anywhere." But deep down, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Respect. That night, after everyone left, the caretaker sat alone by the piano again. He looked at his hands, still shaking from the performance, and smiled softly. The woman walked in and said, "You did it." He looked at her and said, "No, we did. You believed when no one else did." She shook her head and said, "You just needed to believe in yourself again." He smiled, and for the first time, the mansion didn't feel like someone else's world. It felt like his stage, a place where he could finally be himself again. As the lights dimmed and the house fell silent, he whispered, "The music never left me. I just stopped listening." Then he closed the piano lid gently, knowing this was only the beginning of something much bigger. After the night of the performance, everything inside the mansion felt different. The air seemed lighter, and the people who once ignored the caretaker now looked at him with quiet respect. Some even greeted him politely when they passed by, something that had never happened before. The millionaire, who once mocked him in front of everyone, didn't speak much about that night. He pretended it was just another part of the party, but deep down he couldn't forget the way the music had silenced the entire room. It was as if something inside him had shifted too, though he would never admit it. The caretaker continued his work as usual, sweeping floors, fixing lights, and keeping the house spotless. But when the halls were empty, he would sit at the piano for a few minutes each day, letting his fingers move gently over the keys. It became part of his routine now, not as a secret, but as something that gave him peace. The woman who believed in him visited often, bringing sheet music and encouraging him to practice new pieces. She told him that his playing had touched many hearts that night, and that he should never stop again. Her words stayed with him. One morning, while cleaning the library, he overheard two guests talking. They were discussing the video someone had taken during his performance. Apparently, one of the guests had recorded the moment and shared it online. The video had spread quickly, gathering thousands of views in just a few days. People from different places had written comments about how moving the performance was. Some said they cried listening to it. Others said it reminded them of their own lost dreams. The caretaker was shocked when he heard this. He had no idea someone had recorded him. For a long moment he stood still, unsure how to feel. Later that evening, the millionaire called him into his office. The caretaker walked in nervously, unsure what to expect. The millionaire sat behind his large desk, scrolling through his phone. Without looking up, he said, "You've become quite popular, haven't you?" The caretaker said quietly, "I didn't know someone had filmed it, sir." The millionaire looked up, his expression unreadable. "Well, it's all over the internet now. People are calling you the piano caretaker. You've made quite an impression." He paused for a moment, then added, "I'm hosting another event next month. I want you to play again." The caretaker hesitated. "Sir, I don't think I'm ready for that again." The millionaire smiled slightly and said, "You were ready the last time, and it worked. Don't worry, this time it will be bigger. I'll invite people from the media. It'll be good publicity for the mansion." He spoke as if it was all about business, but somewhere behind his words was a hint of admiration. The caretaker nodded slowly, unsure if he had a choice. When the woman heard about it, she came to see him right away. "You should do it," she said. "The world needs to hear you again. This isn't just about one night anymore. This is your chance to share what you love." He looked at her and said softly, "I'm afraid not of playing, but of losing myself again. I don't want to be a showpiece for others. I just want to play because it makes me feel alive." She smiled gently and replied, "Then play for that reason only. Forget the people. Forget the cameras. Just play for the music." The weeks passed quickly. The caretaker spent his nights practicing after finishing his work. The mansion's piano had become his closest friend, the one thing that didn't judge or mock him. Sometimes the staff would pass by quietly, listening from the doorway without saying a word. They could see how deeply he felt every note. Even the millionaire began to stop and listen when he thought no one was watching. He didn't understand music much, but he felt something in it he couldn't explain. As the day of the event approached, the caretaker grew nervous. This time it wasn't a private crowd. It was an audience with journalists, photographers, and even people from the music industry. Word had spread about the mysterious caretaker with the golden touch. Everyone wanted to see him in person. The millionaire made sure everything looked perfect. "Remember," he told the caretaker, "this isn't just your moment, it's mine too." The caretaker nodded politely, though in his heart, he knew this moment belonged only to the music. The night arrived. The mansion was glowing once again, filled with guests dressed in their finest. Cameras flashed and people whispered excitedly about the performance they were about to witness. The caretaker stood backstage, his hands trembling slightly. The woman placed her hand on his shoulder and said softly, "Close your eyes. Forget the crowd. Just listen to the piano. It's waiting for you." He took a deep breath, nodded, and walked out. As he stepped into the hall, the room went silent. Everyone watched him. The man they once ignored now stood in the center of attention. He sat at the piano, his back straight, his eyes calm. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then slowly, he began to play. The first notes were gentle, like a whisper in the dark. Then the melody grew deeper, filled with emotion that wrapped around every person in the room. His fingers moved gracefully, effortlessly, as if the piano itself was breathing through him. The sound filled every corner of the mansion, rich and alive. People stopped moving, stopped talking. They just listened. Some closed their eyes. Others wiped away tears quietly. The caretaker played as if telling his life story through the keys. The pain of losing everything. The loneliness of working unseen. The quiet nights spent dreaming of music. And the joy of rediscovering his gift. The melody rose and fell like waves on the sea, pulling everyone along with it. Even the millionaire stood still, his usual confidence gone. For the first time, he felt humbled. When the final note faded into silence, the caretaker kept his hands on the keys, breathing softly. The room remained quiet for a few seconds, then burst into applause. People stood clapping and cheering, some shouting his name. Flashlights flickered, cameras clicked, and the caretaker bowed his head humbly. Tears filled his eyes, but he smiled, a smile that came from deep within. After the performance, reporters tried to speak to him, asking how he learned to play, where he came from, and what inspired his music. He answered softly, "Life teaches you everything if you listen carefully. Music was always inside me. I just stopped hearing it for a while." His simple words touched even more people. The next day, the performance was everywhere, on the news, on social media, in newspapers. People called him an inspiration, a reminder that talent can live anywhere, even in those who have been forgotten. Invitations began to arrive from music schools, concert halls, and television shows. But the caretaker didn't rush into any of them. He still showed up for work every morning, sweeping the same floors and greeting everyone with a quiet smile. The millionaire began to see him differently. He no longer treated him like a servant, but as someone worthy of respect. One evening he said to him, "You've done more for this house than anyone else. You made it come alive." The caretaker replied gently, "I only played what was already here. The music just needed to be heard." A few days later, the woman visited again. She told him that a local music academy wanted to offer him a position as a teacher. "They want you to inspire others the way you've inspired them," she said. The caretaker hesitated. "I don't know if I can teach anymore," he said quietly. She smiled and replied, "You already do, just by being who you are." He thought about it for a long time that night. Sitting by the piano, he realized how far he had come from the man who once hid in the shadows. He wasn't just the caretaker anymore. He was someone who had found his voice again. But he also knew he couldn't walk away from the place that gave him a second chance. In the following weeks, he started teaching a few children from nearby towns in the evenings. They came shy and unsure, but he taught them the same way he had learned, to feel the music, not just play it. The mansion became filled with laughter and melodies again. The millionaire surprisingly allowed it, saying, "If it brings more life to this place, I'm all for it." The caretaker found joy in those simple moments, watching a child smile when they played their first tune, hearing the sound of music echo through the halls. The woman often visited, helping with lessons and encouraging the children. Together they created something beautiful, something pure. Sometimes, late at night, the caretaker would sit alone at the piano and play quietly, thinking of everything that had happened. He remembered the humiliation, the laughter, the nights of loneliness, and the courage it took to rise above it all. Now, when he looked at his hands, he didn't see the hands of a worker, but the hands of a musician who had finally come home to his gift. He realized that life had tested him, broken him, and rebuilt him piece by piece through the power of music. It wasn't fame or applause that mattered to him. It was the feeling that his story, once hidden in silence, had found a voice that could touch others. And so, the caretaker kept playing. He played for the children, for the guests, for himself, and for anyone who needed a reminder that no matter how lost you feel, your passion can always bring you back to life. The mansion that was once filled with empty laughter now echoed with real joy. Every note that left the piano carried a message of hope, whispering softly to everyone who listened that sometimes the greatest music comes from the quietest hearts. The night of the grand event arrived, and the mansion looked brighter than ever before. Crystal lights shimmered from the ceiling, and soft music floated through the air as guests began to fill the hall. The millionaire was in his best mood, greeting everyone with confidence. He loved attention, and the parties he hosted were often the talk of the town. Every corner of the mansion sparkled with elegance, but the caretaker quietly moved through the background, setting up tables and checking the decorations. He didn't speak much, yet his eyes held a calm strength that came from years of quiet endurance. The pianist woman arrived early, dressed with grace and carrying a secret excitement in her heart. She looked around for the caretaker and found him polishing a glass near the back of the room. She smiled softly and whispered, "Are you ready?" He froze for a moment, his hands trembling slightly. "I don't know if I should do this," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder and said, "You've already done it before. Just let your heart play again." He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the grand piano that stood in the center of the hall. It looked both familiar and intimidating at the same time. As more guests poured in, laughter echoed through the hall. The millionaire took the stage and thanked everyone for attending. He loved making long speeches about success, wealth, and ambition. The pianist woman stood near the piano, pretending to check her sheet music, while the caretaker stayed hidden near the side, waiting for the right moment. His heart raced every time he heard the piano's soft notes being tested. He couldn't believe he was about to perform in front of these people, the same ones who had laughed at him not long ago. The pianist woman finally walked up to the microphone and announced, "Tonight I'll be performing a duet with someone very special. Someone who reminded me that true music doesn't come from fame but from the soul. The crowd murmured in curiosity. The millionaire raised an eyebrow and smirked, whispering to a guest beside him, "Who could it possibly be? Another one of her students?" But the murmuring grew louder when the caretaker slowly stepped forward from the shadows. The guests exchanged confused looks. Some whispered, "That's the janitor!" Others chuckled, thinking it was a joke. The millionaire laughed the loudest and said, "Wait, are you serious? Him? If he can play that piano, I'll marry him myself." The crowd burst into laughter. The caretaker stood still, his face calm but his heart pounding. He didn't say a word. The pianist woman gave him a gentle nod and he walked toward the piano. The sound of laughter faded slightly as people leaned closer, wondering what he would do. He sat down slowly, his fingers hovering above the keys. For a moment, everything felt distant, the laughter, the lights, even his fear. All he could feel was the cool touch of the keys beneath his fingertips. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first few notes were soft, hesitant, like whispers of a forgotten song. But then the melody began to flow, and something magical filled the air. The caretaker's hands moved with grace and emotion, painting a story through every note. The room that was once filled with laughter now fell completely silent. Every chord carried years of pain, hope, and lost dreams. His music spoke of love, loss, and life itself, something no words could ever express. The guests who moments ago were mocking him now stared in awe. The millionaire leaned forward, his smile fading slowly. He had never heard anything so powerful, so human. The caretaker's music filled the hall, wrapping everyone in its emotion. The pianist woman joined in, her part blending perfectly with his. It was as if they had been playing together for years. The rhythm built higher, the notes trembling with passion. The caretaker's eyes glistened as he remembered his mother's words, his lost years, and the promise he had made to never stop playing. When the final note echoed through the hall, silence followed. It lasted only a moment before the entire room erupted in applause. The sound was thunderous, sincere, and full of admiration. People stood to their feet, clapping with genuine respect. The caretaker's hands trembled as he looked around, still unsure if this was real. The pianist woman smiled proudly, tears welling in her eyes. She whispered, "You did it." The millionaire stood motionless for a moment before slowly approaching the piano. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar, humility. "I don't know what to say," he said quietly. "That was incredible." His voice carried no mockery this time. The caretaker looked up at him, uncertain of how to respond. The millionaire extended his hand and said, "You've reminded me of something I forgot long ago and what it means to truly feel." The caretaker shook his hand, and the crowd continued to cheer. For the first time in years, he smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. The pianist woman stepped forward and took his arm, leading him to the center of the stage. The applause grew louder and several guests began recording the moment on their phones. Some shouted praises while others simply stood in awe. The caretaker didn't seek fame or attention, but in that instant, he realized that the music had spoken for him in a way words never could. As the night went on, people couldn't stop talking about the performance. The caretaker became the heart of every conversation. Guests who once ignored him now approached with admiration, asking questions about his background and training. He answered humbly, saying, "I just played what I felt inside." The millionaire, trying to regain his composure, laughed awkwardly and raised his glass. "Let's hear it for the man of the night," he declared. But even he knew this was no longer his stage. It belonged to the caretaker now. The pianist woman watched quietly from the side, her heart full. She knew this was only the beginning for him. As the caretaker walked through the crowd, people stopped him, shook his hand, and praised his talent. Some even asked if he would perform again. He didn't know what to say, still processing everything that had happened. It all felt like a dream he never expected to live again. Later, when the guests began to leave and the hall slowly emptied, the caretaker found himself alone with the pianist woman. The room was quiet except for the faint echo of laughter fading away in the distance. She turned to him and said softly, "You see? You never lost it. You just needed a reason to believe again." He looked at the piano, then at her, and said, "It wasn't just belief. It was kindness. You gave me that." She smiled and said, "Music always finds its way back to those who love it." It was waiting for you all along." They stood in silence for a moment, both understanding that something special had happened, something that couldn't be planned or rehearsed. The caretaker sat down again at the piano, this time playing a gentle tune just for the two of them. The notes filled the empty hall, carrying warmth instead of sorrow. As he played, the millionaire quietly reappeared at the doorway, listening. His expression was softer now. When the caretaker finished, the millionaire spoke from across the room. "I owe you an apology," he said sincerely. "I shouldn't have mocked you. I thought money and status could measure a person's worth, but you proved me wrong tonight." The caretaker looked up and simply nodded. "It's all right," he said. "Sometimes people forget what matters most." The millionaire sighed and walked closer. "You've reminded everyone here of something real, something money can't buy. I'll never forget that." Then he turned and left, leaving the caretaker and the pianist woman alone in the golden light of the empty hall. The caretaker sat quietly for a while after that, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. The laughter, the music, the applause, it all played back in his mind like a dream. For years he had hidden his gift, thinking it no longer mattered. But tonight had changed everything. He had not only proved himself, but had reminded others that real beauty often hides in unexpected places. When the lights began to dim, the pianist woman said her goodbyes and left him with one last smile. "You'll see," she said softly, "this is just the beginning." He nodded, not sure what the future would hold, but for the first time in years, he felt hope rising inside him. He looked once more at the piano before turning off the lights and walking out of the hall. The night was quiet, the air cool, and the stars shone brightly above the mansion. As he walked home, he hummed the melody he had played, every note reminding him that his life was no longer defined by his past struggles, but by the music that still lived within him. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that this moment, this single night of courage, had changed his story forever. The days following the performance were unlike anything the caretaker had ever experienced before. The once quiet mansion now buzzed with stories about him. Guests who had attended the party couldn't stop talking about the mysterious caretaker, who had stunned everyone with his music. Some said he played like a professional. Others said his music carried emotions that words couldn't explain. For years, the caretaker had walked unnoticed through the hallways, but now every worker greeted him with new respect. Even the millionaire treated him differently, speaking to him with a softness that no one had ever heard before. In the mornings, when he arrived to start his work, people stopped him to talk about the performance. They asked how long he had been playing, who taught him, and why he had never said anything before. He answered humbly every time, saying he simply loved music, but life had taken him on a different path. It was strange for him to be the center of attention, yet he handled it quietly without pride. Inside, though, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. The pianist woman who had discovered his talent visited the mansion again. She brought with her a small camera and said she wanted to record him playing, so she could share his story with her students. He hesitated at first, shy about being filmed, but she convinced him it could inspire others who had lost their dreams. So he agreed. That afternoon, she recorded him playing a simple, heartfelt melody while the sunlight streamed through the windows. His hands moved effortlessly, his expression calm and full of feeling. She uploaded the video to the internet later that night, writing only a few words in the description: "The caretaker who reminded us what real music means." Within days, the video spread far beyond what anyone expected. Comments poured in from people all over the world. Some said his music made them cry. Others said it gave them hope. Many couldn't believe that a man who worked as a caretaker could play with such grace. The story of the millionaire's mockery and the caretaker's performance became a symbol of humility and hidden talent. News reporters started contacting the mansion, asking for interviews. Music teachers shared his video with their students, calling him a real-life example of perseverance. The caretaker didn't even own a phone capable of seeing the full response. But the pianist woman told him everything, smiling as she said, "The world finally sees what I saw in you." The millionaire, though surprised, took the situation with unexpected humility. He realized that the story reflected not only the caretaker's strength but also his own mistake. He invited the caretaker to his office one morning and said, "I've been thinking about that night. You showed me that money and pride mean nothing if the heart is empty. I want to make things right." The caretaker looked confused. The millionaire continued, "I want to sponsor you to help you record your own music, maybe even play for others. You deserve that chance." The caretaker sat quietly, his hands clasped. "I don't know what to say," he replied. "I've never wanted fame. I just wanted to play again." The millionaire nodded. "Then let the world hear you play. Not for fame, but for the message you carry. People need to know that greatness can come from anywhere." After much persuasion, the caretaker finally agreed. The millionaire arranged for a small recording studio in town to help him create his first album. The pianist woman volunteered to help with the arrangements. It was a humble setup, nothing too fancy. But to the caretaker, it felt like the beginning of a dream he thought had ended long ago. When he sat in front of the piano in that studio, the room fell silent. The recording engineer pressed a button and the caretaker began to play. Each song he recorded carried a story. One spoke of loss, another of hope, and another of finding peace after years of silence. He didn't read music sheets or follow rules. He simply played from his heart. The pianist woman sat nearby, often moved to tears. When they finished, she told him softly, "This is more than an album. This is your story." They decided to name it The Keys of Hope. When the album was released online, it quickly gained attention. People who had seen the viral video rushed to listen. The comments multiplied, filled with gratitude and admiration. "This music heals," one person wrote. "It reminds me of my father." Another said, "I'm crying and I don't even know why. There's something pure about his playing." The caretaker couldn't believe it. He never imagined that something born from years of struggle could touch so many hearts. Meanwhile, life at the mansion also changed. The millionaire began treating all his employees with newfound respect. He no longer made jokes at their expense or used his position to belittle others. The performance that night had humbled him deeply. He even started a charity program to help struggling artists and caretakers, saying it was inspired by someone who taught him what real success meant. The caretaker didn't seek credit, but quietly continued his duties at the mansion, now filled with warmth instead of mockery. Weeks later, a local music school invited the caretaker to perform at an event, celebrating community talent. At first he hesitated. The thought of standing before a crowd again frightened him. But the pianist woman encouraged him. "You've already done it once," she said with a smile. "Now it's time to do it for yourself." He agreed, though his hands trembled as the day approached. The auditorium was packed with people of all ages. Some came because they had seen the video. Others came because they wanted to witness the man whose music touched the world. When he walked on stage, dressed simply as always, the audience clapped warmly. He bowed slightly and sat down at the piano. For a few seconds, he stared at the keys, feeling a rush of emotions. Then, with a deep breath, he began to play. The music that filled the hall that evening was unlike anything the audience had heard before. It was tender yet powerful, full of emotion yet calm. It spoke of quiet courage, of years spent in shadows, and of the beauty of rediscovering oneself. Every note felt alive, as if carrying a piece of his soul. By the time he finished, many in the audience were in tears. The applause that followed seemed endless. The caretaker stood up slowly, his eyes misty, and bowed once more. After the performance, several reporters tried to speak with him, but he politely declined most interviews. "I'm just grateful to share my music," he said gently. "If it helps someone believe again, that's enough." His humility made him even more admired. The story continued to spread, not because of publicity, but because people felt inspired by the simplicity and sincerity of his journey. That night, when he returned home, he sat by his small window and looked up at the stars. The world outside seemed both vast and peaceful. He thought of his mother, of the promise he had once made to her, and whispered, "I kept it, Ma, I finally did." For a long time, he sat there quietly, his heart full. The next morning, the millionaire came to him with another surprise. "I've arranged a small celebration here at the mansion," he said. "Everyone wants to honor you. Just one more performance, nothing fancy, just friends and family." The caretaker smiled nervously but agreed. He didn't know it would turn into one of the most memorable nights of his life. That evening, the mansion was once again filled with guests. Not the same proud crowd as before, but a mix of people from all walks of life. There were other caretakers, cooks, gardeners, musicians, and local families. The millionaire himself welcomed them warmly, no longer as the man who showed off wealth, but as someone who had learned to value humanity. When the caretaker sat at the piano again, the crowd grew quiet in respect. He played a melody that combined everything he had learned, the pain, the hope, and the joy. It was beautiful beyond words. When he finished, the millionaire stood and clapped first. Others followed until the hall echoed with cheers. The pianist woman sitting in the front row had tears streaming down her face. She whispered. He found his light again. The caretaker stood up, smiled shyly, and said only one thing to the audience. Thank you for listening. Later that night, as the guests left and the lights dimmed, the millionaire approached him and said, You've changed this place forever. And you've changed me too. The caretaker looked down modestly and replied, Maybe music does that. It reaches places words can't. The millionaire nodded, then handed him a small envelope. Inside was a letter of appreciation and an offer to continue his music full-time with full support. The caretaker was touched but said, I'll keep working here, at least for a while. I like being part of this place, and so he did. Life didn't suddenly turn into a fairy tale, but it became fuller, kinder, and more meaningful. The mansion was no longer just a place of work. It became a symbol of second chances. The caretaker continued to play every evening after his chores, and sometimes the staff would gather to listen. The sound of his piano drifted through the halls like a gentle reminder of what humility and perseverance could create. His story kept spreading, reaching hearts far beyond the mansion walls. And though he never sought fame, his music continued to inspire people everywhere, proof that true greatness often begins quietly, in the hands of someone who never stopped believing. Months passed since the night that changed everything in the mansion, but the caretaker's life continued to shine brighter each day. He still arrived early in the mornings, wearing his simple uniform and warm smile, but now everyone saw him differently. The other workers treated him with deep respect, often asking him to play a few tunes during lunch breaks. The millionaire, once proud and distant, became kinder and more thoughtful. The mansion felt lighter, as if music had cleansed the place of all the arrogance that once lived there. The caretaker didn't let fame or attention change who he was. He still polished the silverware, arranged flowers in the hallway, and made sure everything was spotless before guests arrived. Yet sometimes, when the halls were quiet, he would sit at the grand piano and let his hands speak again. His music was softer now, full of calm instead of pain. Each note carried gratitude. People who visited the mansion often stopped to listen, even if it was just for a few minutes. They said his music made them feel something peaceful that words could never explain. One morning, the pianist woman returned with wonderful news. She had been invited to perform at a charity concert in the city, and she wanted the caretaker to play with her on stage. The event would raise money to support children who dreamed of learning music, but couldn't afford lessons. The idea touched the caretaker's heart deeply. He smiled and said, If my music can help them, I'll do it. The millionaire happily agreed to sponsor the entire event, saying it was the least he could do to honor the man who changed his heart. The weeks leading up to the concert were busy. The pianist woman and the caretaker practiced every evening after work. The mansion staff often gathered quietly outside the room just to listen. Sometimes the caretaker would stop mid-song and laugh shyly, saying he still wasn't used to people watching him. But the pianist woman always reminded him, You're not performing for perfection. You're performing for hearts. He liked that thought. It reminded him of his mother's old saying that music was meant to comfort, not to impress. Finally, the day of the concert arrived. The caretaker wore a simple suit provided by the pianist woman, but he looked more graceful than any celebrity on stage. The auditorium was filled with people, including the millionaire and many of his guests from that unforgettable party. The lights dimmed, and the caretaker took a deep breath as he stepped into the spotlight. He could feel his heart pounding, but instead of fear, he felt peace. The pianist woman smiled at him from across the stage, and together they began to play. The music they performed that night wasn't written on any sheet. It came straight from their souls. The melody began gently like a whisper of memory, and slowly grew into something powerful and emotional. The caretaker closed his eyes, letting his fingers move as if they had a life of their own. Every sound carried his journey, from loss and loneliness to rediscovery and hope. The crowd was mesmerized. Some swayed with the rhythm, others closed their eyes to feel the emotion more deeply. When the final note faded, the hall fell silent for a heartbeat, and then applause filled the air, echoing endlessly. Tears rolled down the caretaker's cheeks as he stood and bowed. The audience stood too, giving him a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Cameras flashed, people cheered, and yet in the middle of all that noise he felt a quiet stillness in his heart, the kind that only comes when a person has finally made peace with their past. The millionaire sitting in the front row had tears in his eyes. He clapped the loudest, proud not only of the music but of the man himself. After the concert, journalists and musicians came to meet the caretaker. They asked about his life, his journey, and what inspired him. He answered simply, "I just played what I felt. Life taught me more about music than any school ever could." His humility made everyone admire him even more. One music teacher said, "Your story will inspire generations. You've shown that true talent doesn't need luxury. It only needs heart." The caretaker smiled quietly and thanked her. The next morning, newspapers and online articles carried his story once again. Headlines read things like, "From Caretaker to Concert Star" and "The Man Who Played His Way into the World's Heart." But even with all that attention, the caretaker stayed the same. He continued his daily work at the mansion and practiced the piano during quiet hours. Fame had come to his doorstep, but he treated it as just another visitor, kind but not permanent. The millionaire noticed this and admired him more. One afternoon, he invited the caretaker for tea in his study. It was the same room where they had first met years ago, when the caretaker had been too shy to even look him in the eye. But now, things were different. The millionaire smiled warmly and said, "You know, I used to think power was everything. But that night you played, I realized real power is in kindness and humility. You taught me that." The caretaker shook his head and replied, "You just listened, sir. That's what made the difference." The millionaire leaned back and said, "I want to do something in your honor. A music foundation for underprivileged children. We'll call it the Keys of Hope after your album. It will give others the chance you never had." The caretaker was speechless for a moment, his eyes filling with emotion. "That's more than I ever dreamed," he said softly. "Thank you." The foundation launched a few months later with great success. Music schools partnered with it, offering free lessons and instruments to children in need. The caretaker often visited, sitting with the kids and teaching them how to play simple melodies. The children adored him. He would tell them, "Don't worry about being perfect. Just feel the music and it will guide you." Watching their small hands learn the keys reminded him of himself as a boy, sitting on an old piano bench with his mother smiling beside him. Years passed, and the caretaker's name became known not just in the city, but around the world. Yet he never left the mansion completely. It was his home, the place where his story had changed. The millionaire grew older, and often told visitors the tale of how a humble caretaker had taught him more about life than any business deal ever could. The pianist woman continued performing across the country, always dedicating one song at every concert to her friend, saying, "This is for the man who reminded me why music exists." The caretaker aged gracefully, his hair turning silver, but his fingers never lost their touch. Whenever he played, people said the same thing, that his music carried warmth like sunlight after rain. He lived simply, quietly, always grateful for the second chance life had given him. And though he never chased wealth or fame, he received something far more lasting: love, respect, and peace. One evening, years later, he sat alone in the grand hall of the mansion. The piano gleamed softly under the chandelier. He played a gentle tune, one that spoke of time and gratitude. The staff had long gone home, and the hall was filled only with his music. As he played, he thought about everything that had happened: the laughter, the mockery, the applause, and the kindness that had changed it all. His eyes glistened as he whispered, "It was worth it." The millionaire, now old and walking with a cane, entered quietly. He listened for a while, smiling. When the caretaker noticed him, he stopped playing, but the millionaire waved his hand. "Don't stop," he said softly. "Your music keeps this place alive." The caretaker smiled and continued playing until the song ended. The two men sat together in silence for a moment before the millionaire said, "You know, I meant that promise all those years ago, the one I made as a joke. If you could play that piano, I'd marry you. Well, you played it, and instead I found a lifelong friend." They both laughed warmly, the sound echoing in the quiet room. That night, as the stars shone above the mansion, the caretaker looked out the window and felt nothing but peace. His life had come full circle. He had once been invisible, laughed at for his simplicity, but he ended up touching hearts around the world with nothing more than sincerity and love. The story of the caretaker and the piano became a legend, told in classrooms, music halls, and homes, reminding everyone that no dream is too small, and no talent too hidden to be rediscovered. And so, his music lived on, not just in recordings or newspapers, but in the hearts of those who heard it. Every child who sat at a piano, every adult who found hope again, carried a piece of his story forward. The caretaker never stopped playing because for him, the piano wasn't just an instrument. It was life itself, a reminder that even the quietest souls can create the loudest echoes of beauty when they find the courage to share their song.